Welcome back to Succeed with Dyslexia. In this series, we discuss news and topics that go on in the dyslexia community. So make sure you like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Here's all the content that's going to be covered in this episode. We'll kick off this episode by first hearing from Hawes of Cadmus Inclusive. Afterwards, we'll be joined by Paloma Forde of Screening for Dyslexia. Next, we'll hear from Katrina Cochrane, a specialist teacher and assessor. Afterwards, we'll be joined by Jenna Kenyani. Jenna will share a little bit about her experience in having dyslexia and making sure you're getting the right therapy as it applies to you. And in our last interview, we hear from Flohr and her experience working as a dyslexia consultant. Throughout this episode, we'll be talking about the importance of early intervention and the difference between screening and assessments. We'll also be discussing the positive impact that tailored support for people with neurodiversities can have on people's lives. Figuring out whether dyslexia might be present in an adult or child can often be quite complex. There's been lots in the news recently about identifying dyslexia, with Matt Hancock trying to steer a bill through Parliament to ensure screenings in schools for children takes place. At the heart of this work lies the belief that the label of dyslexia is an important one. It enables the right support to be sought out, hopefully helping those with dyslexia to reach their full potential. But where do we begin on this kind of dyslexia discovery journey? Succeed with Dyslexia's Donna spoke to Hawes of Cadmus Inclusive, asking just what we mean by early intervention.
What does early intervention mean to you? How can you explain that to people who think, what is that? Is it all just about assessment or is it something else?
It makes you laugh because we talk about staging and intervention and we expect some recover some sort of alcoholic here when we're going to... I think for me, early intervention is spotting that we've got, I always call them my tiny humans, we've got a tiny human here who is, despite their best endeavours, not getting out of school what they should be getting out of it. But also with dyslexia, and I'm sure we'll talk about stereotypes later, but their wider life. And actually, there's an unexplained reason why this person is struggling, and it's not from lack of effort on their part. And so for me, it's about spotting it at the first available sign, getting in there quick and giving them the tools that they need and the empowerment that they need to be able to flourish to the very best of their ability and to be in their best possible state of feeling safe and secure within that. For me, actually, early intervention is not about waiting for the label, in inverted commas, of dyslexia. It's spotting, here's a need, let's get in there quick. That need might lead us down a dyslexia pathway, but it also might not. But the sooner we get in there, if it's our humane responsibility and we do something about it to help that child, the better. Because otherwise, I think we fall really, really in big danger of that child falling out of love with learning. And when that's happened, that journey's so much harder. And that child might even fall out of love with themselves because they're not able to access the things that their friends can in the same way. So it's all about getting in there as quick as you possibly can. And then that's the first step of that journey. If you like, you find their mountain and you're going to help them climb it.
If people want to know more about themselves or their children, there are screening tools that allow a more in-depth look at dyslexia, but it is not what we call a formal diagnosis. Sometimes a screening test is a first step before diagnostic assessment. The screener will usually show the probability of dyslexia, with low, moderate, and high probabilities shared. It is often advised that if the results come in at a moderate to high probability, then a full diagnostic assessment may need to be considered. Darren chatted to Paloma Forde of Screening for Dyslexia about the important differences between a dyslexia screening and a full diagnostic assessment.
You mentioned around the difference between screening and then actual full diagnosis. And then I guess, for people that work in the field, in the dyslexic kind of field, I guess, and or in the educational side of it, that I've people have said to me before, what's the difference between a screening and a full diagnosis? But there are masses of difference. Do you think we need to do more to educate around the difference between the two? And do you feel?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think I know. Matt Hancock at the moment is trying to really push for this universal screening, which I think is fantastic as long as they do it in at a younger age. I don't quite know the ins and outs of what age, but yeah, definitely, because a screening will give a probability rating, and it will say, and it can be as high as 95%. So it can be as low as 10. And if you're looking at a child's profile, literally you can see the strengths and weaknesses, and you've got a 95% probability, you're not really going to ignore that, are you? You've got to just put in the right interventions. And that's also the other thing I think, teachers need a lot of training, is what does that intervention actually look like? What is that? What does it mean? What is that? So for me, the difference, again, it's two things. I always say in a good setting, it's having adjustments. So like, I mean, I know you're working on the other side of it with adjustments in the workplace, which is really important for adults in this day and age. I see it a lot in LinkedIn, but it's actually making the right adjustments when the children are really young as well. Something as simple as not having a whiteboard, having a yellow background, making conscious effort to the size of the fonts and what type of fonts, where a child sits in the classroom, not letting them copy from the board, giving them, pictures to, for sequences story, loads and loads of things.
So what exactly is a dyslexia assessment comprised of? Well, we had the opportunity to ask Katrina Cochrane about her expertise on the matter.
Could you give us a quick overview of the types of assessment that somebody like you would be working with children and adults around?
And certainly the other thing is that all of the tests that I use, generally, about 90% of the tests that I use are American anyway. So it's very similar across the world, the diagnostic assessment. But there are lots of different ways into finding out about whether or not someone is dyslexic or not. We start with checklists. We've got some commercial screeners. For adults, we've got workplace needs assessments, where we look at the technology that somebody might need to do their job properly. So not everybody needs a full diagnostic assessment, and certainly people who come to me, they contact me with a query. I go through quite a process with them to find out exactly what they need. These are not cheap. Lots of times grandparents have paid for them. Parents have been saving up for a long time for them. So I want to make sure that they're really using their money properly. And for some, I say, no, use your money for some teaching, for some tuition, because having that label isn't going to help you specifically now. You don't need to spend the money now. For others, like students, getting disabled students allowance, which in the UK is brilliant, and it's a real passport to technology support, even things like extended library loans, things like that. It's really worth having that diagnostic assessment report to trigger that additional support in university. Although I must say, universities are pretty good. They're very well funded and do support students very, very well. Better than schools, actually.
In this next segment, Jenna will be speaking with us about what the impact might be on an individual's mental health when they're not getting the proper support, including the long-term repercussions that a negative school experience could have on people's lives. We'll also be taking a look at how fundamental systems of support are not in place for neurodiverse people, including within the educational system and therapy, and how people need to work with neurodiverse minds to help combat the anxiety that comes with big picture thinking.
And this is why I think we need to be talking more and more about the impact that this has on people's mental health, because this is something that if we don't support our children in our education system, then the long-term effects are as effect on them for their whole lives, and that's not okay when we can do something about it. And then, we put children in a position that the education system isn't right for them. So for me, for example, if I talk about myself, because I'm not going to talk about everyone, but I was in a situation where even though I went to a fantastic secondary school and they tried to be as supportive as they could, there were definitely teachers that weren't, and they definitely continued to impact me. But the education system itself wasn't set up for someone like me. And so it was this constant reinforcement that I wasn't good enough, I wasn't going to achieve, I wasn't going to get anywhere. And so obviously this continuously had an impact on my mental health. And then when I did struggle with mental health issues, then the therapy wasn't right for me.
Yes.
And I did so many different types of counselling, CBT, all sorts, and nothing felt like it quite fit my brain. It felt like I was speaking to people and they didn't understand. I was often getting given homework.
That's right, there's writing journals, which is obviously
it's like it doesn't work for my brain. And like I said, I'm constantly a big picture thinker. Like my head is always like whizzing around, and it's got all of these different things. And all of these therapists would be like, no, you don't want to think about all of it, bring it. And I'm like, I just
the opposite.
Can't.
Yeah.
It's like, I understand that makes sense that you do that, but you need to understand that that's logic. That's just how my brain functions. And so when I work with my therapist, she gets that. She's allowed me to find new ways to not get overwhelmed by all the big picture thinking and to bring it back, but without having to get rid.
Yes.
Without having, being like, okay, this is how you work. Let's work with the way your brain works and still get you to kind of deal with the anxiety that comes with that big picture thinking.
Now, research by the American Psychological Association indicates that up to 82% of people face feelings of what we call imposter phenomenon, struggling with the sense that they haven't earned what they've achieved and feeling like they are a fraud. We know that imposter feelings are strongly linked to increased anxiety and depression. But what's the relationship between feelings of imposter syndrome and dyslexia? Donna chatted to dyslexia consultant Sue Flohr about her experience of dyslexia and imposter syndrome, focusing on the impact that receiving a dyslexia diagnosis had on Sue's mental health and her overall understanding of herself.
And this leads on to some of the things I know we want to talk today about, which is imposter syndrome, because I know you've been very open over the years about your own dyslexia. So again, for our listeners, Sue, could you just give us an overview of your journey with dyslexia as an individual, when you got assessed, how that impacted on you as well?
Yeah, I think when you first mentioned imposter syndrome, I had to look it up to make sure I knew what I was talking about. I think, as with many dyslexics, we think we might know what words mean, and we just skim over them and perhaps go off on the wrong track. So it really was an eye-opener to me to talk to you at first about imposter syndrome. Like, oh gosh, if I'd have known what it really was, perhaps I would have had a better understanding of me. I wasn't diagnosed until I was quite old, really. I had a family with many children who were all dyslexic, a husband who was dyslexic, but I wasn't quite sure that I was dyslexic because I had a really good education. But I was always feeling that I didn't quite achieve as much as people expected me to, and perhaps I was considered as lazy or distracted and disinterested. And it wasn't until I was quite old and doing some more studying a foreign language, that I decided that I needed to get assessed. And it was a bit of a cheat, really, because I thought, well, if I'm assessed, I'll be able to use a computer and it will put all the accents on for me, because I could never know where to put accents with foreign languages. And yet dyslexics sometimes are considered not to be good at languages, but I could speak quite a few of them, but actually writing them was a tricky business. So I got myself assessed and was quite disbelieving, really, when I did get the result, but it confirmed a lot. And I found out I had it confirmed that I was dyslexic. And I think had I had that early on, perhaps I wouldn't have had imposter syndrome. Perhaps I would have had a better understanding of myself. I think it's really important to get diagnosed early so that you can learn to work with your strengths rather than your weaknesses, or improve on your weaknesses. But for me, it was really late. And I think by that time, I probably had poor self-esteem, unnecessarily, didn't really begin. If somebody tells you you're bad, at something and keeps telling you, eventually you begin to believe it yourself, don't you? So I think had I known a lot earlier, I would have done things quite a lot differently.
That brings us to the end of this episode, but here's a little snippet of what's to come. Throughout August, we'll be talking back to school and bringing you parents lead advice from Caroline Smith and Liz Lully. We'll also be joined by Lorraine Peterson to discuss good practice in schools for dyslexic learners and the assistive technology that is available to support them. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to click this link here and view episode 16. You just watched episode 17, and yes, we do come out with a new episode every single month in the hopes of spreading more awareness about dyslexia. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.